As you see, I don't have a PowerPoint. Because my point today is, I want to convince you of the power stories can have. Because I want to tell you that today, this morning, I drove to work. I work as a junior producer at a production company, and I arrived on time. As I sat at my desk before my colleague, he came in and asked me, how do you always manage to be on time? I told him that I get all my things ready the night before, I set several alarms, I hurry up and leave almost on time. That's reality. And it's a story. Because we are no computers, we don't meticulously list every detail chronologically, and this is the reason why everything we tell is subjective. Everything we tell is a story. We leave things out, we forget things, emphasize things, forget other things. That's just normal. And this is the way that we can shape our world by deciding the story we want to tell. I can rewind for a minute now, and I could tell him a different story, which shapes my reality differently. I could tell him that I don't eat breakfast in the morning, that I sometimes have to run to the car with a dripping cup of coffee in my hand, and I initiate overtaking maneuvers on the highway as if my job was more that of a stunt woman. That's also reality, just told as a different story. Two different stories came out of one and the same reality. And depending on which story I choose, I create a different future, which results only from me telling this one story as it is. Through one story, he finds me hardworking and motivated and maybe praises me in front of my boss, which might increase my chances of getting a pay raise. Through the other story, he doesn't praise me in front of my boss, but finds me likable and has to laugh hardly, and maybe this is the beginning of a new friendship. These are two massively different possible futures, and that's not even all. The waves I create through my story, that my colleague now thinks differently of me and praises me in front of my boss, also come back to me. Because my colleague now thinks differently of me and treats me with more respect, he respects me more, and I notice that. My self-image changes, and even if I'm not on time one time, I remain cool. As you see, my story and the way I tell it initiates waves which might lead up to a new character trait. But unfortunately, as is the thing with waves, you can't always control the direction in which they move because external factors also play a role. I mean, I wish it was that easy to tell your story confidently one time and have your future as a CEO in your pocket. I'm sorry, I can't give you that today. But what I can give you is the advice to always stay aware of your power of your story and to keep adjusting, counter-steering, and redirecting whatever waves you get back. Because then, in the long run, you are in control of your future. I've now talked about the external realm of stories, the ones we tell each other. To this external realm, it also includes many things we see from a cultural perspective, like fairy tales, legends, customs, traditions, everything that has been passed on and accumulated into what we now call the history of mankind. The history of mankind is, as you see from the things which make it up, also subjective. It's also a story, nothing is fact-based. You also see this in the German language, because the word we use for history is the same word as the one we use for story, it's Geschichte. In the English language you can also hear it, because the word story is included in the word history. History is just a story that has survived, because like others before him, Winston Churchill said, history is written by the victors. The victors survive, and with them their stories, which impact the future, which impact the self-understanding of peoples, of nations, how we understand morals or the sexes, what we eat, how we eat, that's so crazy. And because all of this makes the future up, I find it so fascinating, and this is also the reason I want to be a director. That's the reason I'm a filmmaker. because I want to tell stories. I want to perpetuate perspectives and spread them among the people. Especially those stories whose roots would otherwise have been forgotten, but whose emotions and perspectives are important and we can learn or gain something from them. As I keep talking about this topic, I just keep realizing how wonderful and deeply ingrained stories are in our everyday lives, but not only in the external world that we just talked about. In addition to this external world, there's also an internal world. And by internal world, I mean just up here, me, myself, and I. Because we don't only talk in stories, we also think in stories, because our thoughts are structured like stories. In our thoughts, we are, of course, also subjective. I mean, we leave things out, we emphasize things. I personally forget a lot of things. And this is the reason why this is also a story. It can also have a huge impact on our lives. In our thoughts, it's not important what we tell ourselves, because we know everything we know. The emphasis is on the why. For example, let's think about all the reasons why I lay my clothes out in the morning. What reasons could I emphasize? What story could I tell? And what future could possibly result from this? For example, I could tell myself, well, it's forward-thinking and laudable to put everything out the night before, as I'm making an extra effort to be on time. On the other hand, I could also tell myself, well, I'm so lazy in the morning, I never get up on time, I always have to rush, and that's the only reason I have to stand in front of the mirror for 20 whole minutes the night before, because I can never choose, and that's just horrendous. And as you see, concerning these stories and their impact, I'm either an exemplary pedant or a chaotic late riser. That's a huge difference. And it makes such a huge difference whether I think to myself every evening that I'm lazy or that I'm standing here because I'm self-disciplined. Because this narration, this very positive or negative narration, gets ingrained in my thinking, in my self-image. The self-image, which determines nothing less than how we see ourselves, how we feel and act according to it, how others see ourselves, and ultimately, how happy we are. If we take this thought further now, to the next story and onwards, we have a month, a year, a whole life that is only what it is because of stories. Happy, sad, successful, whatever you tell. So let's pause for a second. Wouldn't it be great if with this power over our story, we couldn't only change our lives, but our collective future? I have a question for you. Who of you wants to have an impact on the future or change something in the world? You can raise your hands now, please. Wow. Oh my God, that's so great. I'm really happy to see that. So I think what you're interested in now is how can you, with the power over your story that you already have, change the world? Quite simply, you keep telling your story, but not concerning your individual, local horizon, but concerning our collective, global horizon. As we already know, the closer a story is to us, the more impact it has on our emotions, our actions, our environment. And although our environment is always around us, always local, it's not necessarily only local. In our modern world, our simple everyday lives are immensely globalized. In our simple everyday lives, for example, we eat apples from New Zealand, we eat chocolate from the Ivory Coast, we use cell phones from China, and wear wool, which comes from Pakistan. Although these things are so close to us, I mean, they could not literally be any closer. We have them in our hands, we wear them on our bodies, we eat them. These realities could not be further from us. because these stories are not part of our story, but they have to be, in order to make us care, in order to make us want to change something. If we want to fight for a better global future, we have to bring these facts, these issues, these realities and their stories into our horizon, where they touch us and move us and where they create the urge to change something. By telling these stories, the melting of the polar ice caps because of our local emissions, child labor in fast fashion factories because of our local clothing habits, are not only headlines we scroll mindlessly over on our phones and we forget like the second we read them, but they become real, tangible realities which we understand, and they move us and they make us want to change something. And this is how change is created. We are moved, and therefore we eat different things, buy differently, wear different things, or buy less in general. Everyone who can't help directly where these problems are can help by telling these stories. Telling global stories with a local context creates change. And this change creates an impact which spreads from one end of the world to the other end of the world, creating a better global future. Stories have the power to change us, to change our realities, to change our future, to change our lives. And every one of you is a storyteller. Every one of you has a voice. And with this voice, you have the power and the responsibility to keep stories from being forgotten, to bring them to life and to keep them alive. With our stories, we change the world today. We shape the future of tomorrow for ourselves, for all of us. History is written by the victors, said also Winston Churchill. And I say, the future is written by the storyteller. Thank you for listening to my story, and thanks for coming today.